My name is Mike Bondi. I'm a professional engineer. I'm an AE 911 Truth petition signer and a volunteer with AE 911 Truth. To begin with, I want to mention that on your way into the auditorium tonight, you should have received some materials, a pamphlet that looks like this with some information about AE 911 Truth. The second item that I want to draw your attention to is a letter to members of Parliament regarding a petition for a public Canadian investigation into 9/11. It looks like this is a two-sided sheet. Your support of this initiative is extremely important to us, and it's the reason behind this Canadian tour. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the Reagan administration, put it this way. In an article entitled, "The Critics of 9/11 Truth, Do They Have a Case?" He writes, "The 9/11 Truth critics have nothing but ad hominem arguments. It is not conspiracy theory to examine the evidence and to state that the evidence does not support the explanation that has been given." And he goes on to say, there is no 9/11 debate. On the one hand, there are credentialed experts who demonstrate problems in the official account, and on the other hand, there are non-experts who denounce the experts as conspiracy coups. The experts are cautious and careful about what they say, and their detractors have thrown caution and care to the wind. That is the state of the debate. Tonight, we will hear compelling evidence from one of those credentialed experts. Our speaker this evening has been an architect for 24 years in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a member of the prestigious American Institute of Architects. His deep concern about the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center high-rises on 9/11 began after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin. Dr. Griffin was interviewed that eye-opening day in May of 2006 on KPFA's Guns and Butter radio program by Bonnie Faulkner in Berkeley, California. This changed our speaker's life radically and launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11, inspiring him to found the organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. AE 9/11 Truth now numbers over 1,600 architects and engineers and 14,000 others, all demanding a new investigation into these catastrophic structural failures. Richard has been known as an expert, a leader, a patriot, and even a hero to many, and I'm fortunate enough to count myself among those who also call him a friend and colleague. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm Toronto welcome to Richard Gage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's awesome to be back in Toronto again. I've spoken in Toronto once with Dr. David Ray Griffin, who I'm honored to speak with. Another time, as you noted, with the Toronto hearings, which was an extraordinary experience for all of us who were honored by being able to speak on behalf of the 9/11 Truth movement with the best evidence put forward ever. So we expect great things from this DVD that's forthcoming. And I want to thank you for your courage and your willingness to reconsider this very difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center with its staggering loss of life. You know, just as architecture and engineering projects are sometimes quite difficult, sometimes very joyful, this particular project has proven to me to be one of the most difficult. Not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, though, but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions and finding people open-minded and willing enough, like yourselves, to come and to examine the facts. So our commitment to you tonight is to speak the truth and to leave you with extremely valuable science-based information that will help you winnow science from conspiracy. And there's a lot of difference. But please check out the facts that you hear tonight. We're not looking for believers. This is not some kind of new religious cult, right? Do your own research. Because after all, doubts about the official investigation don't begin with the 9/11 Truth movement. Let's start with the 9/11 commissioners themselves, who were mostly lawyers and politicians, not engineers. They said, 2 of them, that we were set up to fail. This is not to be considered the last word on the attacks, but only a beginning. What did they mean? Tim Romer, we were extremely frustrated with the false statements we were getting. Max Cleland, this investigation is now compromised. It's a national scandal. America's being cheated. The White House wants to cover it up. I'm quoting members and former members of the 9/11 Commission for a very good reason. John Farmer, the senior counsel of that 9/11 Commission, I was shocked at how different the truth was from the way it was described. The tapes told a radically different story from what we have been told, what's been told to us in the public. There was an agreement not to tell the truth. What government and military officials told Congress, the Commission, the media, and the public about who knew what and when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. These statements, in and of themselves, any one of them, are enough for a new investigation, after all. It served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries, in which over 1 million people have already perished, and the ensuing global war on terror, a permanent state of war, as we're told, and a host of other ills that we're suffering from in the U.S. and around the world, here in Canada certainly. All of this remains intact if we continue to ignore or sweep the truth about 9/11 under the rug. And only the truth about 9/11 will stop another 9/11 type attack from happening again. So these are the reasons that we need to dedicate ourselves and peer back into this painful part of our recent world history. We care very much about our country in the U.S., and I know you do as well. We care about our hard-won and all too easily lost civil liberties, which were destroyed by legislation such as the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, and Executive Order NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, in which any of us in the U.S. can be called a terrorist, put into jail, no right to a trial, no right to an attorney, and held indefinitely. Does that sound like the kind of America that you learned about? Guess what? You have C-36 here in Canada, and it's almost as bad. So we're hoping that you'll join us in creating a groundswell of demand for a real investigation. I've been an architect for 24 years. I've worked on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. I'm going to show you tonight why, though, that I've devoted over 100% of my time in the last 3 years to the issue of the truth about the destruction of these towers. But like many other architects, I've designed and worked on many projects, including the day-to-day construction administration services for this $120 million high school in the Bay Area in California. And more recently in Nevada, I worked on the construction documents for this $400 million mixed-use project with 2 million square feet of retail, parking structure, and fireproof steel frame mid-rise office space, altogether over 1,200 tons of steel framing. The unburnt wood structure below. So keep this in mind, because we're told the towers and the third skyscraper, which we'll be talking about, came down due to fire. Well, what would we expect of fires in steel frame buildings? There's been massive tests, particularly this one in Cardington in the UK. Let's take a look, because it's quite relevant.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags. It can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
These fires that you just saw in this test were 2 to 3 times the temperature of the fires in the towers and World Trade Center 7. So this is very relevant. Let's keep going. There are 3.5-hour fires over 5 floors in Los Angeles and 18-hour fires over 8 floors in Philadelphia. And in Caracas, Venezuela, fires that burn 17 hours over 26 floors. Not one of these has ever come down. Or the other 100 or so very large, very hot, very long-lasting fires. And we'll see how hot, large, and long-lasting fires the fires were at the World Trade Center. But buildings that fall due to natural causes, as we're told basically, a catastrophic collapse in the case of this third skyscraper due to an initiating cause, the structural members are not completely disconnected from each other. They don't fall like a house of cards. We see a building that's basically at the bottom. The concrete is not pulverized to powder. Keep this in mind also. These buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like smoke with pulverized solids in the mix, in these cauliflower-shaped plumes that are expanded by the hot gases from the chemicals released or activated in the explosives. We have a very thick edge defined that's expanding rapidly outwardly. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these characteristics, you know you have explosions. Now, this is relevant because explosions are not a part of the official story of any of these high-rise destructions. Explosions, of course, can be harnessed quite efficiently to bring down buildings in controlled demolitions. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to make our comparison, because this is the most commonly used method to demolish high-rises. So this is what they look like when they're being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally the purpose is to remove a structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so economically. So typically a tall building like these are demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and then detonating them in a very precise order, starting with the interior structures and progressing outward and upward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight to pull the exterior inward, and destroying from the building from the ground up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do much of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse, like you see here, at nearly free-fall acceleration into a consolidated pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish, and fire never has. So keep this in mind when you see the third skyscraper, particularly, that we're going to be talking about tonight, come down. Of the third worst structural failure in modern history, something that most architects and engineers are completely unaware of still. World Trade Center Building 7. How many of us are pretty unfamiliar with this building? Raise your hand real high. I need to count you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let me tell you about this. It's pretty amazing. It was half the height of the Twin Towers, and it's almost as high as the highest building here in Toronto. It just was dwarfed because these were the tallest buildings in the world. We'll get to them in a moment. It's about a football field away from the North Tower, and it wasn't hit by an airplane. So it's an interesting case study, because everybody says, well, all that jet fuel, all that airplane impact. Set all that aside. Let's focus on World Trade Center 7 for a moment. It stood all afternoon after being hit by a few beams from when the North Tower came down. NIST said that those beams, that damage, was not significant in terms of the cause of destruction of this building. Here it is standing just fine after the towers came down. What we're going to see if there are any of the characteristic features in this building now, starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Well, let's listen to Daryl, a medical student, who was there that day watching it, and he's interviewed on the evening news, local New York station.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and you know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, well, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. Then, you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caved out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. You know, we were in shock, and then
a sound of a clap of thunder, a shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. Well, let's listen to Dan Rather on CBS News describe for us what he's looking at as he's watching, which for many of us may be our first look at the destruction of this World Trade Center Building 7.
What you're seeing are eye shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we're going to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible picture work. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? So here's Dan using his intuition to describe what he's seeing. He's seeing the old hotels come down in Las Vegas, for instance, and that's great, except we haven't had Dan tell us about the destruction of this building since 9/11. What happened to the media? We're going to be looking at that in a moment. With like 2 or 3 exceptions in the last 10 years, we have not seen this building coming down on mainstream media, even though, as I mentioned, it is the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like one, especially since no high-rise has come down except for being brought down with explosives, and especially since no high-rise has ever come down due to fire. You would think that this would be the first source of investigation that NIST would go after with its massive resources and brilliant intellects. But no, they did a beeline for fire, and they never examined seriously at all the hypothesis of controlled demolition. This is the hypothesis that they focused on. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. I'm not kidding you. So, NIST focuses on this floor here, the 12th floor. The floor with the worst fires on it, actually. And at column 79, where those fires were raging, according to the official story, and while they were raging, what they did is expand these beams here, causing this girder to travel off of its seat on this column, 79, causing this floor, 13, to fall on 12, 12 on 11, 11 on 10, and so on. Now, there are 23 different problems with this initial initiation of failure. Actually, these beams couldn't have expanded because they're fireproofed. Fireproofed beams are insulated from heat. They don't expand. Okay? Let's say they weren't fireproof, though. They could not have expanded because there are shear studs tying them to the structural concrete slab, or the lightweight concrete slab, the diaphragm up above. Well, they said those shear studs snapped as this was expanding. How did they get them to do that? They did not apply any heat to the concrete floor up above. They applied all the heat to the 50-foot-long beams in just 1.5 seconds. All the heat went into that beam, forcing it in the computer model to expand up to 4 or 5 inches, and breaking those shear studs. This is called fraud. Every one of these things I'm pointing out can be spelled F-R-A-U-D. It's a problem for the official story. So let's just say all that could have happened. Could it have pushed this girder off of its seat on this column? No. It would have had to have pushed it 6, 7, 8 inches in order to get off of its seat. So even with a maximum expansion of these beams under those unrealistic circumstances, the girder couldn't even have fallen off. But let's say that it did. If this girder fell off of its seat, this floor still wouldn't have fallen on the floor below. Why? Because there are 2 other girders framed into that column. That floor would have held. This girder would have simply just hung and maybe drifted halfway down the column. But let's say that there were no other girders framed into that column holding that floor up, and they all fell for some reason, and this floor still wouldn't have probably even gotten to fall on this floor, much less caused its failure, because the underside of this floor is just as robust as what you see here structurally. But let's say that that happened. This floor falls on this floor, and the next one, you have an interior cascading collapse for 9 floors, leaving column 79 unbraced, and it buckles. So we need an investigation of the fires as well on this back side of building 7, away from the North Tower, away from the source of those fires. Interestingly enough, this photo shows that those fires are completely out on this side of the building, where they said it was fully engulfed. Over an hour before, those beams were supposed to be expanding and causing the initiation of failure at 5:20 in the afternoon. So if the fires were out an hour before the building collapsed, they could not have been expanding those beams. Those beams would have gotten hot and cooled again. IRS, Department of Defense, Giuliani's bunker, emergency management, Securities and Exchange Commission, which we talked about. This is really one of the more highly secure buildings in the world, okay? Outside of the towers and the Pentagon. Do we think it's reasonable to assume that Al-Qaeda or anybody else could have gotten access to this building? No, this is some sort of, probably of an inside operation, right? This is why people call us conspiracy theorists, because we tiptoe toward the implication, which is obvious if this was a controlled demolition, which most all of us agree with. So that's why we're getting serious about producing evidence and demanding a real investigation. You've seen now how important our work is at AE 9/11 Truth. We're used as the point of credibility, one of the key points of credibility in the 9/11 Truth movement, to bring about public awareness and to bring about a real investigation, because we have the technical experts, 1,600 of them. I'm not kidding you, we have people that are so dedicated to waking up their countrymen here in Canada and in the US and all around the world. So join us. We are a non-profit organization. We're doing everything we can, but our hands are tied without funds. We're not even able to make ends meet on this 12-city tour. We've got a lot of work to do. And we've done it. We've created now a movie which will be available for you to purchase, and it's taken us 2 years and a whole lot, thousands and thousands of hours of volunteer effort to create this documentary in which we've interviewed 50 technical experts. Let's talk about the Twin Towers first, because the evidence for the Twin Towers is actually quite even more clear than Building 7. Once you look at it with a different lens, if you will, a different framework. Let's examine the structure of this building first. I mean, this is innovative. They won awards for the structure. Even NIST applauded the structural engineer, saying it did its job against the airplane impacts, blaming fires mostly for the destruction of the building. But for the first time in history, in the early 70s, when this was finished being built, they grouped the core columns around the elevator shafts, allowing 20 meters of open office planning between the core and the perimeter. That had never happened before. Before, it was a forest of columns every 20 or 30 feet in the building. Look at this open office planning here. This is really quite extraordinary. And we'll come back to that because it makes some important points. But these core columns, 47 of them, were absolutely massive and almost solid steel at the base, over 1 meter long and 1/2 meter almost wide, solid steel, fitting to 4, 5, 6, 7 meters in the middle. And then the lightest steel, way up at the top, just 1 centimeter or 2 thick, with these wide flange or I-beams. The structure around the outside is massive, more steel than glass. That's why this is sometimes called an exoskeleton, like a crab almost. Massive resistance to 100-mile-an-hour winds. And it's 100,000 tons of heat sink. Any fires in any area of this building would be absorbed and conducted away from the source of heat. That's the real reason none of those fires and those high-rises you saw have ever destroyed a high-rise, because it's so effective at getting the heat away from its source. So let's look at the jet plane impacts. 8:46 in the morning, the North Tower is hit by Flight 11. Some people actually think the planes knocked the buildings down or something like that. No, the damage wasn't significant enough, according to NIST. The fires did most of the damage. And it was hit about 12 stories down. Now, 15 minutes later or so, the South Tower's hit about 30 stories down. But it's the first one to fall. It falls after only an hour burning. And in fact, that fire burned out before the building came down. Compare that to those other fires that we saw that burned for 3 hours, 8 hours, 17 hours. Well, let's look at the official story here. We have massive fires on this floor that we don't have real video or evidence of, particularly in the South Tower, which was out just prior to its collapse. So it causes the sagging of these floor trusses. When these floor trusses sagging, this speculates that these columns bowed inward. And that inward bowing was observed in the videos. So they felt justified in thinking that they would bow inward when it sagged. But there's no additional force, lateral force, pulling that in by a sagging truss. Indeed, sudden onset of destruction, just like the firemen are saying, pop, 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 as you'll hear all the way around the building. Is there enough similarity between these two to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? We think so. I saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. There's no fire down there. What are light sources being emitted from the building doing? I saw low-level flashes. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. You heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, initially an orange, and then a red flash came out of the building. Then it would just go around the building on both sides. Sudden onset, almost free-fall acceleration. Is there any similarity between this known controlled demolition on the left and this South Tower on the right? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? I saw flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. Hear what these journalists and other first responders and officials had to say.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, like a bomb went off, and another explosion, and was flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, the building was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden, you hear an explosion, and then you see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
Are we seeing upward, outward, arching, pyroclastic-like clouds trailing freely flying, laterally ejected objects in a geometry almost of fireworks? Or are we seeing a gravitational collapse? How does gravity work? Down. Something else is going on here other than what we're told. Let's take a close look. Here's the North Tower. We're told this upper 12 stories drove the rest of the building down to the ground. The second time we look at it, we're going to see something different. There's no movement from the point of jet plane impacts, which is right here. Watch again. No movement down until now. It's telescoping in on itself. Those columns are destroyed right away. Let's take a closer look. Stop. Here's the bands of explosions. Right here, just like the fireman described, wrapping all the way around the belt symmetrically, like a belt symmetrically, and then it comes down. Watch what's happening from below. Underneath this zone of destruction, this violent series of explosive ejections right underneath the canopy. And now, keep your eye as we zoom in on this lower right corner, you're going to see traveling down a massive series of individual explosions, trailing the free-falling, falling almost as fast as the free-falling debris next to it, right here. It is rather extraordinary. Do we have a straight-down symmetrical collapse? Not into the footprint, as we've just seen, but outside, up to 300 or more meters, about each tower. The tower is only 207 feet wide. Look at the distribution of debris, well beyond the boundaries of ground zero. Here's a nice, neat pile of World Trade Center 7, the classic implosion. Here's the very explosive event known as the Twin Towers. 1, 2 seconds, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Dozen seconds or so. These towers are both completely destroyed. That's fast, okay? That's nearly free fall. This 12-story section held by this giant crane is holding it over nothing but air below. It will fall in about 10 seconds at free fall. This one here, with 80,000 tons of structural steel framework that's designed 5 times stronger than it needs to be, is going to try to stop this one. We pull the lever on both these cranes. Now, NIST tells us that they both hit the ground within a couple of seconds of each other. Is that rational? No. In 7th grade, we had enough physics to know that this one's going to be serious. Its progress toward the ground is going to be seriously impaired by that massive resistance designed specifically to be 5 times stronger than it needed to be to hold it. Remember, what the steel is that all that mass has to come down through. And if that upper portion is going to come down, what's it going to do? It's going to meet an equal and opposite reaction from below. That's a destructive force. What do they find? Billions of these tiny, previously molten, iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair. This is extraordinary. What are they doing there? They're very clearly documented. Well, if you had thousands of thermite cutter charges going off throughout the columns and beams in these buildings, and under explosive pressures, that liquid molten iron byproduct of thermite charges would be atomized, not dissimilar from a spray bottle, like I have here. Are you getting wet? They don't try to explain it, by the way. They don't have an explanation. The most curious phenomena in all of the dust, and there's no explanation for it. But they certainly document that up to 6% of those dust samples, in some cases, are these microspheres. Fascinating. They do say that they're so prevalent that it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these, because it's a signature component. Could that explain why all these cars are toasted on the top, liquid falling molten iron droplets, with explaining how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 and 7 collapsed? But relative to the Twin Towers, they didn't do that. They stopped at the initiation of collapse. I'm not kidding you. It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the towers after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached, and collapse became, they claim, inevitable. Wow. Let's look at these failed controlled demolitions and see if you initiate a collapse and the explosions don't go off to complete the rest of the destruction, those structures are extremely redundantly designed. They don't just fall apart like a house of cards, as you see here. You don't want to be the guy that has to go back and fix these explosives, especially this one. And you don't want to be his neighbor. Pile drivers can't crush buildings. The whole theory makes no sense at all, as you see here. So we provide a challenge, and we said, hey, this doesn't work. And they say, oh, you're right. We're unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. We think so, too. It's a tin rack. They'll never read all this, is what they're hoping. It's a $20 million cover-up of the crime of the century, according to Jim Hoffman, in which he documents in Building a Better Mirage the unfounded assumptions, startling omissions, outrageous lies, fudged computer simulations. Is this all direct evidence of explosive destruction? Can fire account for any one of these, let alone all 10 of them? Is there additional circumstantial evidence supporting the hypothesis of controlled demolition? Some people will not wake up to the reality of this information. In the face of overwhelming evidence, they will tell you things they know not to be true, but still say them in order to protect themselves from the implications of the evidence. Okay, we're not alone. We have 300 9/11 survivors and family members, 220 military, intelligence, law enforcement, government officials calling for a new investigation, 400 distinguished academic professors, 200 entertainment media professionals, 250 pilots and aviation professionals, 200 firefighters, all endorsing the call for a new probe into 9/11, including the former defense minister of Germany, the former president of Italy, the former national minister of defense here in Canada, Paul Hellyer, and some distinguished senators in Japan. And the FBI, curiously enough, themselves, quoting, backed by thorough research and analysis, they say our theory is. This is the letter we received from Michael Heimbach, Assistant Director of Counterterrorism. He's not there anymore. We tried to find him to get some support, you know. Thank you for writing this letter. Can we talk? Go on. Why didn't we see the truth about 9/11? Well, it appears as if our government lied to us about the building collapses. The 9/11 Commission reinforced that lie. FEMA and NIST justified it. Of the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry. All these industries benefited enormously from 9/11. So cui bono, right? Who benefited is something that needs to be researched here. There are online, you can get enveloped versions of these in multiple quantities so that you can pass them out. Everybody should have a dozen or 2 dozen of these so that you're giving them out at various times to colleagues, associates, friends, media representatives, government officials, people you know, architects, engineers, anybody almost who watches this 15-minute documentary that we wrote that has Ed Asner narrating this extraordinary development of the destruction of World Trade Center 7 will come around and agree, oh my God, you're right. This is a controlled demolition. Then they're open. Then they're ready to talk about the Twin Towers. David Ray Griffin is the preeminent researcher, the kind of the grandfather of the 9/11 truth movement, if you will. 9 books on this subject outside the World Trade Center towers also. He covers things like the Shanksville plane, the Pentagon situation, the put options in which millions were made by those betting that the next day on 9/11, the value of American Airlines and the other airlines would plummet. If it didn't, they would have lost all their money. And so there was an investigation. The 9/11 Commission reported on this, actually, in the report, and they said, well, the investigation didn't lead to Al-Qaeda, so we didn't need to pursue it anymore. That's the scientific method that they're using. By the way, where did it lead? To a former assistant CIA chief running the Deutsche Bank building. That's just a fact. It's not my conspiracy theory. Sign our petition. Curiously enough, even Zbigniew Brzezinski himself, the former national security advisor for Jimmy Carter, actually warned the U.S. Senate recently in 2007 of such a future false flag attack against America and blaming it on Iran so that the Bush administration could go to war in Iran. If we allow the truth about 9/11 to be swept under the rug of history, more false flag attacks than Americans, more wars around the world with millions more killed, more economic manipulation with worsening financial crisis, more loss of civil liberties, and we become, of course, a whole lot less safe. Whereas the truth about 9/11 illuminates these lies and results in the rectification of each of these disasters. So we see 9/11 in a whole new light, as a way of exposing massive corruption to its heights, and more importantly, though, as a way of recovering from its ills. So it's not too late for yourself. Where do you draw your line in the sand? Do you wait for the next 9/11? Predicted by members of Congress and the media to be far worse than the last? No. Speak out now, for there comes a time when your silence, all of our silence, is betrayal. Thank you so very much for your kind attention.
Anybody know of the name Operation Northwoods? Can we see just a raise your hand?
Just really adept at this. That's how the Reichstag was destroyed by fire by Hitler in order to blame it on the communists so he can come into power. We went into Vietnam as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where torpedoes were alleged to have been fired at our destroyers out there. But that never happened, according to Secretary of State Robert McNamara. But that started the Vietnam War, in which 50,000 soldiers, U.S. soldiers, were killed. Operation Northwoods is a plan brought to Kennedy by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where airliners would be shot down and blamed on Cuba so that Cuba could be invaded. Kennedy turned down that request, and he was killed shortly after that. But the World War I, World War II, the Spanish-American War, the sinking of the Maine, all these are false flag operation-started wars. World War II, the Pearl Harbor, is documented by Robert Stinnett in his book, We Had Cracked the Codes. I'm reporting other research. This is not my research. This is just things I'm aware of. You can do the research. But it's important to know, because 9/11 is just another in a long line of false flag operations that start wars, in this case, Afghanistan and Iraq. In World War II, the codes were cracked, the Japanese codes were cracked, the best warships were moved out of Pearl Harbor, leaving the old ones there to be attacked, manipulating the American people into going to war, knowing that the Japanese were going to make that attack. World War I, the sinking of the Lusitania was leaked to the Germans. This is documented. Because it was a civilian ship, and it was in waters known to be occupied by German U-boats, and it was leaked that they were carrying armaments. So that got us into World War I.
I would say 1 or 2 minutes maximum before the South Tower fell, the TV anchor claimed that the the head of the firefighters in the South Tower said the fire was almost under control, that it was
Right.
just about.
Chief Oreo Palmer was up to the 78th floor. He walked all the way up there. He's reporting that the fire, there's 2 isolated pockets of fire. We can put it out with 2 lines, 2 hoses. And so there's not this raging fire. It was almost out 10 minutes later.
Do I have any words? Oh, absolutely. What did I think? This is my 4th time seeing Richard Gage. I met him 3 years ago. It'll be 3 years for me now that I've been traveling nonstop, pretty much exclusively, just talking about 9/11 and everything else around it, and it leads into many other different things. I'm Max Radico from Grasshopper Media. There you go, something nice. Free fall speed. Yes, I have the formula for free fall speed on the back here with a little bit of Richard Gage and the scientific method. You know, science is really, what is it, the foundation of Obama's democracy, apparently.
Max, what do you think about this Canadian government petition going on?
The petition? Well, firstly, as Max, I don't really have a name, so I don't know if petitions really would work with me in my own self-governance. I don't really need to petition myself, but within this idea of this country that we have called Canada, that is really realistically only a corporation, by all means, any of the shareholders or signatories for that, anybody who's a part of that or thinks that they're a part of that, by all means, put down your legal fiction name. Please, put it to this. We need to have more of the legal fictions up at Parliament, all those owls hanging out together so that they can actually put on a good show for us so that maybe we can think that they've fixed everything for us when we can fix it for ourselves, obviously. All we have to do is just know and stop believing that everybody else doesn't have common sense and that we can't figure this out. I don't know if there is any answer, but the truth will set you free.
So you're down in Toronto now, or?
Yeah, I'm traveling around. I'm down in London, hanging out with the London Truth Brigade, and I come up here for Richard Gage. Missed him in Ottawa yesterday, unfortunately, but I'll be heading up to Montreal next weekend to catch him there again, and looking forward to going out to the Fox and Feather now for a hangout session.
Yeah, we're at the Richard Gage Canadian Tour, Toronto edition. To 9/11 Truth.
TorontoTruthSeekers.com.